Good evening. Welcome to another live stream. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong, and we have an incredible show for you tonight. Thank you all for tuning in. As you come in, be sure to hit the like button because that helps boost this stream in YouTube's algorithm. You can also find all the places to support this channel in the video description below. Sorry about that. Now, let us get started, okay? We have what many are deeming to be an astonishing day where so many revelations have come out. We have had Putin and Trump shocking the world on Wednesday, on the 12th of February, where it was revealed by Donald Trump himself that he had engaged in a 90-minute phone call ahead of the Munich Security Conference with Vladimir Putin. He declared that the call was the beginning of negotiations for peace in Ukraine and an end to Ukraine's NATO aspirations as we know them. The call has sent shockwaves across the world, particularly in Europe, where leaders of the EU have seethed over the possibility of not only an end to the conflict, but also one that doesn't include either themselves or Ukraine at the table at all. What is the geopolitical reality shaping this call and this development? Is it game over for the conflict in Ukraine actually? Well, to discuss all this and more is someone who has followed this conflict from the very beginning, Brian Berletic, geopolitical analyst. He has the YouTube channel, The New Atlas, which you can find in the video description below. Brian, it is a pleasure to be back with you.
Likewise, thank you so much for having me back.
Yes, of course, of course. Well, Brian, let us get started. Let me just pull up for you the Truth Social post from Donald Trump announcing this phone call, and I want your reaction to it. He said, "I just had a lengthy and highly productive phone call with Vladimir Putin of Russia. We discussed Ukraine, the Middle East, energy, artificial intelligence, the power of the dollar, and various other subjects. We reflected on our great history of nations and the fact we fought so successfully together in World War II. Remembering that Russia lost tens of millions of people and we likewise lost so many. We each talked about the strengths of our respective nations and the great benefit that we will someday have in working together. But first, we both agreed we want to stop the millions of deaths taking place in the war between Russia and Ukraine. President Putin even used my very strong campaign motto of quote unquote common sense. We both believe very strongly in it. We agreed to work closely together, very closely, including visiting each other's nations. We have agreed to have our respective teams start negotiations immediately, and we will begin by calling President Zelensky of Ukraine to inform him of the conversation, something which I will be doing right now. I have asked Secretary of State Marco Rubio, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, National Security Advisor Michael Waltz, and Ambassador and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff to lead negotiations, which I feel strongly will be successful. No more lives should be lost. I want to thank Putin for his time and respect for this phone call." I'll stop right there, Brian, because this conversation was 90 minutes long, and many are talking about it as a huge step in the right direction, including Russia itself. Sergei Lavrov has said so much. So, Brian, your initial reactions to what many are saying is a bombshell development in Russia-U.S. relations, given that under Biden, we had absolutely zero talks between the two sides.
I mean, at face value, it looks very promising. It's always better that nations are talking with one another rather than ruling out any sort of discussion while waging war. And that is what the United States has been doing with Russia all along. They're waging war on Russia through Ukraine. This is not a war between Ukraine and Russia. This is a U.S. proxy war against Russia using Ukraine. And so if you understand that fact, even the fact that it continues right now, it is a U.S. proxy war against Russia. The fact that it's continuing under the Trump administration says a lot about the Trump administration. Now, I hear a lot of people celebrating and citing this declaration that Ukraine will have no membership in NATO. People have to remember that this whole war is over the fact that that was initially the deal with Russia, that Ukraine would never end up in NATO. And then the US reneged, and then they overthrew the Ukrainian government. And then and before that, they already had invited them into NATO. They put a client regime into power that would transform Ukraine into a US NATO battering ram to use against Russia. And this included during the first Trump administration. He was the first US president to openly begin arming the Ukrainians, which almost certainly was the red line crossed that convinced Russia that we're not going to be able to resolve this diplomatically. The United States, NATO have for decades, I mean, the whole purpose of NATO's existence is to first encroach upon Russia's borders, encircle, contain Russia, and eventually absorb Russia, just as NATO has encircled, encroached upon, and absorbed all of these nations along Russia's border. So they understand, Russia understands that they're next. That is the purpose of NATO. So if you understand that, if you understand the root cause of this conflict is NATO itself, its existence, and the purpose to encircle, contain, and eventually absorb Russia, then you understand that what we hear from the US right now is simply a continuation of what the US has always been doing. And as a matter of fact, if you listen to US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, I was just listening to his press conference at NATO in Europe, and he's talking about expanding NATO. He's expanding NATO. Nations are spending about 2% of their GDP. The US demands that European nations and Canada spend 5% of their GDP on NATO. So we're not talking about resolving the issue or even freezing the issue of NATO, which is the root cause of this conflict. We're talking about expanding it further. So how is that in actuality any sort of step in the right direction? From what I can see, this is just the US managing a proxy war it is losing, trying to freeze it, a Minsk III, if you will. And again, Secretary Hegseth even said, we need to deal with China, and we need Europe to step up and continue this conflict with, or this is essentially what he's saying, continue this conflict with Russia, hold Russia in Europe while we go deal with China. So this is empire doubling down. This is not dismantling empire, not by a long stretch, unfortunately.
What would you say to those who, when they hear someone like Hegseth or Trump utter these words? I mean, I'll put up what Donald Trump said with regard to Ukraine, because right now you have the entirety of Europe and NATO itself very concerned about the future of Ukraine and also their role in this conflict. And here is Donald Trump saying that essentially Ukraine possibly isn't even a player at the table. I'm curious of what you think about this, given that these words are, in all honesty, the opposite of what we've been hearing from especially the Biden administration, but the neocons in general. Here we go.
Do you expect Ukraine?
Say it. What?
Do you view Ukraine as an equal member of this peace process?
It's an interesting question. I think they have to make peace. Their people are being killed, and I think they have to make peace.
So that is what Donald Trump is saying, that peace has to happen. So curious, Brian, please elaborate, because I know that for me, I'm skeptical in particular, because in order for peace to happen, there has to be a lot of concessions made to Russia. And we are at a very early stage. I believe talks will happen, but your thoughts on, what we can expect, given that there is this rhetoric happening that seems pretty lofty and encouraging to many.
I just think it's interesting that President Trump cannot even bring himself to pretend that Ukraine is some sort of equal stakeholder in this. They are a proxy of U.S. Geopolitical ambition. That is all they are. That is what they have been since 2014. That was the whole purpose of overthrowing the elected Ukrainian government and installing a U.S. client regime in its place. And then from that point onward, under the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations, transforming Ukraine into a battering ram to use against Russia. Now the proxy war is failing. Ukraine's military is incrementally collapsing. Their fighting capacity is collapsing. And they need to do something to freeze the conflict. And for people who have been following this since 2014, they will remember there were several junctures at which the US and Europe needed to try to freeze the conflict because Russia or Russian-backed forces were on the verge of overwhelming their Ukrainian proxies. And so they bought time. We even have people like German Chancellor Angela Merkel admitting that they were just buying time with Minsk to rearm, reorganize the Ukrainians to keep the conflict going. I believe Hollande from France, he also admitted this later on. So that is what is actually happening. That is what is this is what they are really talking about. I mean, yes, Ukraine they need to end the conflict because it is unraveling, and if they don't, it's going to decisively end in Russia's favor. So this is what they are trying to salvage. They're not actually trying to arrive at any sort of peace or any sort of agreement with Russia. And as I said, objectively, if you look at this conflict, NATO's existence, its purpose, the reason it exists is at the root cause of this conflict. Ukraine is just the latest manifestation of this that Russia is reacting to. And the Russians themselves say that this is about NATO. This is about the security architecture of Eurasia, and this needs to be changed. And if this is not changed, then the conflict cannot be resolved. And so this is not, if you're not talking about the root cause of the issue or addressing it, then you're not actually talking about peace. Has the Trump administration talked about the root cause of this conflict, and are they addressing it? And if the answer is no, then the Trump administration is not actually interested in peace. They're interested in foisting the illusion of peace on the public and global leaders.
Well, that's a very good point, Brian. I want to bring up actually Russia's readout, which on the surface, you can see that for Russia, and here it is, the telephone conversation with Donald Trump, you can see that between, which I think is astonishing in and of itself, just if you look at it on the surface, you can see that there's actually a lot of alignment between Trump's, I guess you could say, run-on sentence readout and this one, although this one is much more concise and much more easier to read. But that point that you brought up is very interesting. Vladimir Putin pointed out it was necessary to eliminate the root causes of the conflict and agreed with Donald Trump in that a sustainable settlement could only be reached via peaceful negotiations. I think the key word here is root causes, key words. Brian.
Absolutely. And people have to remember, Russia has never closed the door to diplomacy. It left the door open all throughout the duration of the Biden administration, all during the first Trump administration, as a matter of fact, and all during the Obama administration. If people remember, it was during the Obama administration that Hillary Clinton, in her capacity as Secretary of State, did this huge PR stunt with Russia. They had Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Washington. She had this like a physical red button on a yellow box, like it's actually like an emergency stop button, but they put the word reset on it, and they were talking about this big reset between the U.S. and Russia. And the United States also performed similar theater in regards to Libya and Syria, and all while they were performing this theater of trying to approach these nations and reconcile their differences and reach some sort of agreement and sustainable peace, they were engineering regime change operations aimed at either destabilizing these countries and overthrowing the governments directly in the case of Libya and Syria, or overthrowing the government of nations bordering Russia, Ukraine, for example, but also Belarus and several other countries were all targeted simultaneously by the US, even as they were pretending to try to reach some sort of new agreement, some new arrangement with Russia. So the US habitually does this. This is not unique to the Trump administration. And people will say, well, Trump is different. Trump is not different. Under his first administration, he unilaterally abandoned the Iran nuclear deal based on fabricated lies, deliberate lies. He also left the INF treaty with Russia. That was a treaty. Now you can't argue that that wasn't a treaty. It was a treaty, and the Trump administration walked away from that with Russia, also based on deliberate, fabricated claims. So how can Russia look at this and have any faith at all that this is going to lead in a positive direction? They cannot, and they are not. But they will give benefit of the doubt, at least publicly, while planning in actuality for continuity of agenda, which is what they've been doing all along. Now, I would say that if Russia does agree to some sort of ceasefire or pause, it'll be because they are overstretched and they would like time to rebuild their capacity to continue what will be a continuous struggle with the U.S. and its ambitions for reasserting its unipolar world order on the entire planet, which includes on Russia. So this is what is really going on. People who have been paying attention all along will recognize this cycle that goes around and around and around, regardless of who is in the White House, regardless of who controls Congress. Again, U.S. foreign policy is driven by unelected corporate financier interests. Huge corporations, banks, they determine U.S. foreign policy. They lay it out in policy think tanks that they fund. Those policy papers are taken by teams of lawyers, turned into bills, and lobbyists bring it to Washington to get people on both sides of the aisle to sign off on, which is why nothing changes no matter who you vote for, which is why nothing is going to change here, because those interests have not changed their mind about reasserting U.S. dominance over the planet. They take every opportunity to remind people, even the Trump administration and all of the people he put into his cabinet, if you listen to them carefully, they're still going on about American dominance over the rest of the planet.
Oh, no, I mean, well said, Brian. I wanted to, though, in the spirit of what others may say, because I definitely agree with many of your points. But right now we are seeing a pandemonium of panic, so to speak, coming from many different channels of this neocon establishment. I'm just going to pull up headline after headline, and then we'll end with John Bolton. Here is Channel 4 News. Trump shocks Europe with avalanche of concessions to Putin over Ukraine. Putin will enter with a strong position after the U.S. laid out a generous opening hand. Ukraine won't join NATO. Ukraine can forget about Crimea, and there will be no U.S. troops on the ground. Now, the panic certainly extends out from Channel 4. Here is what The Economist had to say. Ukraine fears being cut out of talks between America and Russia. Hours before Trump's call with Putin, we spoke to an apprehensive Vladimir Zelensky, and you can only imagine what he said, because he says the same thing over and over and over again. And here is now John Bolton. Okay, so John Bolton had this to say after hearing about Putin and Trump's phone call.
Well, I don't have any expectations anymore. I think we know exactly what's going to happen. President Trump has effectively surrendered to Putin before the negotiations have even begun. The positions that Defense Secretary Hegseth announced in Brussels, which I'm sure I'd be stunned if Trump didn't convey them directly to Putin in their phone call, constitute terms of a settlement that could have been written in the Kremlin. Maybe they were written in the Kremlin and got out in propaganda channels. But it's a complete reversal of the U.S. and NATO position on a number of issues. For example, up until today, the official American position was that Ukraine should be returned to full sovereignty and territorial integrity. That's gone. The question of NATO membership as far back as 2008 had been that ultimately Ukraine would become a NATO member. That doesn't look like that's around anymore either. Putin has scored a whole series of victories today. It's hard to encompass them all, but I think one, in addition to these substantive concessions, is that he has now, it seems, exactly what he wants. Putin doesn't want to negotiate with Zelensky. He wants to negotiate with Trump because he thinks he'll get more out of him. And he's absolutely right.
So there you have John Bolton. But this is being said all across Europe. Lamy, von der Leyen, Schultz, they're all saying the same thing, that they need to be at the table and that these are an avalanche of concessions, as Channel 4 put it. Brian.
This is all theater. This is the same left-right theater that we see taking place constantly. Just listen to what Bolton is actually saying. Return full sovereignty of all Ukrainian territory to Kiev. It's impossible. It's physically impossible. If John Bolton was U.S. president right now, he couldn't achieve this. The U.S. is out of weapons. The troops are spread out all around the globe. And they're fixing for a war with China in the Asia Pacific. They're also fixing for a war with Iran in the Middle East. So how are they going to restore Ukraine to full sovereignty if they're out of Patriot missiles, they're out of artillery shells, they have no armor, they have nothing left to give Ukraine? We watched them run out of weapons during the Biden administration. The Biden administration said, for as long as it takes, whatever Ukraine needs. And people are accusing the Biden administration of being half-hearted, throttling military support to Ukraine. Everything that wasn't bolted down and could be sent to Ukraine has been sent to Ukraine. It simply made no difference. If we listen to anyone from the Biden administration and now Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth in the Trump administration, they admit U.S. military industrial capacity is insufficient to fight a war like this. It's not that they don't want to. They physically cannot. And what did Secretary Hegseth say during his press conference at NATO? What was he saying? The United States needs to massively expand its military-industrial base so that it can fight these wars. He's telling you to your face, to the entire planet, it's not that we don't want to fight this war. We physically cannot fight this war. And I see people in my comment sections, in the comment section right now, Brian is so negative, is so disappointing. Is that because this isn't true, or because you simply wish it wasn't true? This is literally what Secretary Hegseth was saying behind the podium at NATO, that they need to expand their military industrial capacity. It's insufficient to fight this war with Russia. I mean, that is what he was saying. So people should go back and listen to that, and listen to it objectively. Don't just pick out what you want to hear and ignore the bits that are inconsistent with what you wish was happening. I wish this was happening. I really do, but it's not what's happening. If you listen to them carefully, they're telling you that this isn't what is happening.
Yeah, and again, I see this development, Brian, as the United States needs to right now negotiate some kind of, as you put it, the conditions are all there. They are not good for the United States, for NATO right now. There needs to be some kind of, if it's not a quote unquote peaceful resolution, they want some way to change the character of the conflict so it works better for them. There cannot be this kind of fighting as it is right now. So there are just conditions that propel someone like Donald Trump to be able to do this, say these things. But then again, this is day one, really. This is step one. This is now you're going to have Donald Trump and his team negotiating at the table with Russia. The media is right. The Western media is actually right. Russia is in a very strong position. So if Russia's in this strong position, Brian, then what does it matter what Donald Trump actually says? Because what is going to matter in the end is what they do when they're at the table. Can someone like Donald Trump, or anybody in the U.S. foreign policy establishment for that matter, literally come to the table and agree to Russian terms? What do you think, Brian? Do you feel like that's a possibility? Because those terms are going to be quite harsh comparatively to what they might have been before this conflict started. Now there's going to be unquestionable terms that Russia will be undeniable terms that they won't change, which are going to cause a problem, I believe, for the establishment as a whole. Your thoughts?
I mean, it's impossible to predict what is going to happen. Again, a lot of this depends on how willing Russia is to continue, because the core issue of this conflict is not being addressed. And as a matter of fact, Secretary Hegseth and President Trump are saying it's not going to be addressed. This problem with NATO, we are going to deliberately make it worse. We're going to make it much worse. So this is not going to resolve the core issue for Russia at all. They're only going to agree to a pause if they think that they can somehow make use of extra time to reorganize, rearm, and get ready for the next confrontation, which is what they used the Minsk agreements for. They knew that the West was never going to uphold them, but they themselves needed more time ahead of the conflict. And we remember the special military operation when it began. There were a lot of areas in which the Russian military still was not ready, and they have been rolling out things they were working on all throughout the special military operation. So that you're exactly right, Danny. Russia they're in a strong position. They are going to win this conflict on their terms. The collective West either has to try to find some sort of compromise to freeze it and prolong it, or they have to at least make it look like they tried, and they're going to try to delay the inevitable for as long as possible, just as they were doing under the Biden administration, under the Trump administration. And again, if you listen to Secretary Hegseth, he's not talking about ending support for Ukraine. He's simply saying we need to transfer this responsibility to Europe because we have a bigger war that we need to go and fight. This is exactly why both under the Trump and Biden administrations, they were talking about withdrawing from Afghanistan, and then they did withdraw from Afghanistan, not because they thought they made a mistake and they wanted to fix it. It was because they had a bigger conflict to prepare for, and they needed to direct all their resources toward that conflict. And so they had to leave Afghanistan to prepare for the proxy war that they were getting ready against Russia for years and years, that they knew what was going to unfold. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at the U.S. trying to salvage a lost proxy war, trying to get the best position possible amid it. Almost certainly it will continue. They will shift responsibility to their European proxies. A lot of people talk as if, this is Europe got the U.S. entangled in this war. Europe is politically captured by Europe. This was the whole premise of the European Union, was to consolidate Europe under this bureaucracy that U.S. special interest corporations and banks controlled, to usurp the sovereignty of Europe. And so that is what they're doing. They're going to shift it over onto Europe. They're going to pretend like they washed their hands of it. And they're going to pivot toward Iran and or China. That's what we're looking at. For people that are asking what's going to happen, that is what's going to happen.
Well, let's actually listen to Secretary of Defense Hegseth for a bit. How about that? He was at the Ramstein group, as you said, NATO, essentially. And I took out some timestamps here. First, we will get to his comments on NATO and Ukraine.
The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. There also must be robust international oversight of the line of contact. To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine.
Brian, I wanted to play that first, and there's more, but I wanted to play that first because, as you have stated, it appears that what Hegseth is saying is that, especially in the initial stages, from what we know so far, the big impetus is about getting the United States to transfer the responsibility for Ukraine. He even said line of contact. If there's a line of contact, that means there's contact. So, Brian, your thoughts?
I mean, what have we been saying for 3 years, Danny? Not just myself, but many other great guests that you've had on and interviewed over the last 3 years, that eventually Ukraine is going to collapse, and they need to create the U.S. and NATO need to create a buffer zone with their own troops inside whatever is left of Ukraine. I've been talking about this for 3 years. I've been warning about that being they're never going to accept defeat in Ukraine, and they will go ahead and they will do this. And they want to make sure that it's a non-NATO deployment because they want to absolve themselves from Article 5 obligations, and they don't want U.S. troops in there because they themselves don't want to get into a direct war with Russia, because this is all about overextending Russia, collapsing Russia, so the U.S. can isolate and then work on collapsing China. That's the whole point of all of this. It's all interconnected. And so they cannot get tangled. And I've said this many times, if the U.S. gets involved in Ukraine, I mean directly intervening, putting their troops in Ukraine, they're not going to have any resources left. We can see how stretched their military is. They're not going to have any resources left for the Middle East or for the Asia-Pacific region, where they're still trying to reassert dominance. So they have to make difficult decisions. And this was the theme all throughout the Biden administration. Their allies, their proxies, European nations, Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, all of these nations, they want to use them, essentially, use them because the U.S. itself is overstretched. They're talking about using the industrial capacity of these nations, their military capabilities, their economy, and basically consolidating all of it. It's like a bunch of companies run very poorly, like the U.S. auto industry, and then it begins to collapse, and they consolidate them all together in some last-ditch effort to try to save something. That is what the United States empire is doing right now. And this is, and again, if you were paying attention and you filter out the left-right rhetoric, you could recognize that what Secretary Hegseth is saying is exactly what was being said all throughout the Biden administration. And this is what's so troubling, because it is this continuity of agenda so seamless, and yet because of people's bias, their political bias and their emotions, they're simply not seeing it. It's very frustrating, but it's very important that people wake up and see this and oppose this, because we're going in a very, very dangerous direction. The U.S. is basing its foreign policy on an irrational premise that a nation that makes up less than 5% of the world can have domination over the other 95+%. This is irrational. And when you pursue irrational policies like this on such a large scale, and we have nuclear weapons involved, it could only end in catastrophe for everybody. And so this is what we need to start thinking about. Not, I voted for this guy, I want my team to win, and I don't really even care if anything they're saying is true or not. I just want to feel like we're winning. Is that more important than continuing down this road toward catastrophic global conflict?
Well, that's the difficult, I think, circumstance, condition of this development here, is that it comes on the heels of this massive political transition in the United States, which it does serve to, I think, cloud a lot of the realities that you're talking about, Brian, because in retrospect, there really is nothing. If Donald Trump doesn't do what he's doing right now, Donald Trump is going to make himself very irrelevant very fast. Again, for me, and we're going to get into more Hegseth now, it's not about what they're saying, it's about what they actually do. But even in what they say, there are massive contradictions that are going to have to be reckoned with. And we're going to listen to one right now, Brian, because all throughout, even at the best of what the Trump administration has been saying, and I'm going to say that this is, for me, when I look at this development, Brian, I see that this is massively different rhetorically, and even, picking up the phone, talking to Vladimir Putin. This is different. How we interpret why it's different, I think, depends on how we want to see the reality. For me, I see it as, well, this is all that there really is for the United States right now. If they do not do this, if Trump doesn't do this, he's irrelevant. But all throughout this, Brian, even Hegseth, even Trump, they've all been saying they're going to increase sanctions. And here is what Hegseth had to say about this part of their peace approach with Russia.
To further enable effective diplomacy and drive down energy prices that fund the Russian war machine, President Trump is unleashing American energy production and encouraging other nations to do the same. Lower energy prices, coupled with more effective enforcement of energy sanctions, will help bring Russia to the table. Safeguarding European security must be an imperative for European members of NATO. As part of this, Europe must provide the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine.
So more effective enforcement of sanctions, Brian. And of course, back to, I mean, Hegseth did this a bunch where he, in his talk in Brussels, he would continuously refer to the need to put everything on Europe, basically saying, Europe, you're up. This is your conflict now. But your thoughts about this sanctions bit, because I think this is it would be very interesting to see Donald Trump bring this to the table because it's a non-starter. Not only is it a non-starter, but I'm curious on your thoughts about how this has all gone already. There's 24,000 of them on Russia as we speak.
This is literally a continuation of what the Biden administration was doing. I mean, if you weren't looking and you weren't familiar with his voice and you weren't aware that an election took place, you would swear that this was just another day in the Biden administration. This is all they've went on about for the last 3 years. Sanctions, sanctions, sanctions on Russia. They're still talking about it. If you go to the think tanks where all of this foreign policy comes from, again, regardless of who is in the White House or who controls Congress, this is all the think tanks are talking about. They're looking for every little sanction, but even the think tanks understand that the sanctions aren't working and they probably aren't going to work, but they don't know what else to do. So again, this goes back to the core issue, which goes even beyond NATO. It is America wanting to maintain primacy over the entire planet. And it is physically incapable of doing it, but it insists on trying anyway. And so this is what happens. You have sanctions that don't work. You have a military that's overstretched and cannot keep up with these nations that the US is targeting, especially Russia, especially China. And then we just see a continuation of them going in these circles with the only tools that they have, even though they tried to pretend that some sort of political transition did take place between the Biden and Trump administration. They're still waving around the same set of tools that they have been trying to use to get Russia to the table, get them to at least freeze the conflict so that they can reprioritize with war with China. And by the way, war with China is still war with Russia. It is ultimately is a war on the multipolar world. And so it doesn't really matter who you're targeting. If you're targeting any one of these nations that are pillars of the multipolar world, you're attacking the entire multipolar world. And so people have to try to understand this. I mean, why is he still talking about sanctions? And did you notice he's still talking about weapons flowing to Ukraine? He's just saying, we're not going to do it. Why are we not going to do it? Because we don't have any left. And we need to save the weapons that we have left for all these other wars that we're planning. By the way, where does Europe get a lot of its weapons from? From the United States. So, yeah. I mean, these are all things that, look past the headlines, listen to what they're actually saying. They are telling you nothing has changed and that they're just doubling down on everything that they've been doing up until now.
And I would argue, Brian, that a lot of the reasons why Europe is losing its mind is not so much because now it feels like there's going to be some significant burden it's going to have to bear. In truth, Europe can't bear any kind of burden on anything, really, because it is so dependent on the United States. If anyone travels through Europe, if you go to Germany, just walk the streets of Berlin, if you go anywhere in Europe that is a mainstay in NATO, you know that the United States essentially controls these countries, especially at the level of foreign policy and quote unquote security, national security. So there is you can spin it however you want. You could say, okay, it's there, pass you the ball here and now it's yours. But at the end of the day, the ball is on a tether. So they're actually together. And we can go now to Hegseth again, Brian. Because what the Trump administration is doing is which I believe is a big part of its political orientation, which has served to change its approach and works for this approach. Joe Biden as a neocon, very passionate American interventionist, He can't say, well, we're just in it for ourselves. But Donald Trump can say, well, it's all about the United States. Who cares about anything else in the world? That's what they can do. And I think that's what's allowing them to actually engage in this right now as a way to buy some time. But here is what Hegseth had to say, though, about American isolationism, but with a bit of a China twist. Here we go.
We're also here today to directly and unambiguously express that stark strategic realities prevent the United States of America from being primarily focused on the security of Europe. The United States faces consequential threats to our homeland. We must and we are focusing on security of our own borders. We also face a peer competitor in the communist Chinese with the capability and intent to threaten our homeland and core national interests in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. is prioritizing deterring war with China in the Pacific, recognizing the reality of scarcity and making the resourcing trade-offs to ensure deterrence does not fail. Deterrence cannot fail for all of our sakes.
So the communist Chinese, Brian, are the big threats intertwined. I find this very interesting, intertwined with the threats on the border, if we want to call it a threat. But the border and China, those are the big threats, actually. And they will deter China and with the resourcing needs possible to ensure that this peer competitor does not get too powerful. So, Brian, your reaction to this, because in my estimation, this is just an art. This is literally an admission that the priority now is to move to the Indo-Pacific, to China. Your thoughts?
Well, exactly. Again, continuity of agenda. This is what the Biden administration was obsessed with. Ultimately, China. And even though people like to pick, people on the right like to pick on the Biden administration, they like to call President Biden Beijing Biden. But in reality, throughout the entire Biden administration, they were preparing for war with China. That was the top priority. This conflict with Russia is meant to isolate China before the U.S. focuses entirely on China. If you have been following along over the last 2 decades, China building up its Belt and Road Initiative to circumvent possible maritime choke points, the U.S. is already preparing to cut off Chinese maritime shipping through. The U.S. has been desperately trying to cut the Belt and Road Initiative over land. If China shares this long border with Russia, and these two nations are allies, the huge amount of natural resources that Russia possesses, the ability to move trade through Russia to many other countries, you can't isolate China. You need to diminish, overstretch, and if possible, topple and then politically capture Russia to then further and fully cut off China. That is the whole strategy. It has been since the end of World War II. This is all that they've been doing for decades and decades, again, regardless of which administration is in power. And Secretary Hegseth is tying this to the border, because if he just explained what the U.S. is really trying to do, the U.S. wants to be the preeminent power in the Asia-Pacific region, in Asia, where the U.S. isn't even located on a map. American people would say, why are we doing that? So they have to tie China to the U.S. border, to fentanyl, to illegal immigration, it's demagoguery. It's to scare the American people. It's to incite fear and hatred and panic. It's just another pretext, a false pretext the U.S. is using to legitimize its foreign policy, just like they lied about WMDs in Iraq, or they lied about human rights violations in Libya or Syria. They're doing the exact same thing vis-a-vis Russia and China, and ultimately they're trying to tie everything to China. Again, I don't blame people for not sitting down for 4 hours and listening to Senator Marco Rubio while he was going through his confirmation hearing as Secretary of State. But for 4 hours, that's all he talked about was China. China this, China that. China is the root of all of our problems, and we have to deal with China, which is all they said for 4 years under the Biden administration, 4 years under the previous Trump administration, 8 years of Obama, and so on and so forth. It is the continuation of this policy. Ultimately, they need to stop China from surpassing the collective West. If it surpasses the collective West, it'll do so irreversibly. And this is simply something the special interests that control the collective West cannot tolerate. They just, on so many levels, they cannot tolerate it. And so that is what is driving all of this foreign policy, ultimately. So now, I mean, how do people listen to that and walk away thinking that anything has changed in terms of U.S. foreign policy? I don't understand it.
Well, for me, Brian, what seems to be changing here is not so much the what is the ultimate agenda, right? I don't believe the United States is going to quit on trying to contain the multipolar world, to weaken it, to destroy it, with China at the head. I don't believe that it wants to allow Russia to continue on a path of stability and growth. However, it seems like the how is really in question. The how now the difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration can be viewed as, well, how does this occur? And what is really at stake here, it feels like, Brian, is that we are in a moment where the Trump administration ultimately seems to be expressing an admission of defeat. Even Trump, when he talks about BRICS, 100% tariffs, he reiterated that today, I defeated BRICS. Nobody batted an eye at the tariffs that were being proposed against BRICS. Nobody said, well, we're not going to join BRICS because of that. But a lot of this bluster mixed with attempts to kind of stall, it feels like it's more of a, well, what is the next move, rather than what is the best move for peace? What is the next move for empire? That's what it feels like for me. What does it feel like for you?
That's exactly it. It's what is the next move for the U.S. empire? Nothing is working, and they need to reorganize, regroup, and redirect their efforts, their energy, their resources. That's all this is. It is all just rearranging the deck chairs on the sinking ship that is American imperialism. That's what has been from administration to administration. That's what it continues to be. When the Trump administration says America first, the MAGA movement is just branding slapped on the continuation of U.S. hegemony worldwide. That's all it is. If you ask me, what does America first mean? I would say it should mean leaving the rest of the world alone and investing inward. Doesn't mean isolationism. You can trade with everybody. You can trade and deal with absolutely everyone, but invest inward on your own country. Build a real economy that is based on actually making tangible things, not playing with numbers on spreadsheets, but actually making physical things. I don't know, kind of like how China and Russia, why their economies are able, I was listening to the Hudson Institute the other day, one of these think tanks, corporate funded think tanks, and they were complaining about how they used to joke about how small the Russian GDP was, and all of these stereotypes about how weak and pathetic the Russian economy is. But it turns out that they admitted this, what the GDP is actually made up of is very important. So the US has a massive GDP, but if all of it is pyramid schemes on spreadsheets, then what real meaning does it have in the physical world? When you go to war, how does that actually physically, tangibly help you? It turns out the Russian economy is based on natural resources and manufacturing, which gives it tremendous power. So it's a much smaller GDP, but it packs a bigger punch. And so this is what America needs to look inward and do. They need to build a real economy. They need to prioritize the American people over these corporations that place profit above all other purposes, including the self-preservation of America as a functioning nation state. But what does America first really mean for the Trump administration? It means putting these corporate financier special interests first. That is what the tariffs are there to do, to preserve and reassert American corporate monopolies, all of the monopolies they have over the auto industry, telecommunications, including things like smartphones, everything that the US held monopolies over for decades. That is what this is all meant to preserve. All US foreign policy is aimed at preserving the corporate financier interests. That's what they mean by America first. And it by no means means investing inward on America. It means reasserting American dominance over the entire planet. I was listening to Jamison Greer, the US trade representative, during his confirmation hearing before the Senate. And literally in his opening statement, he said that all trade policy should contribute to making America dominant in all areas, economics, military, technology. That is the actual goal here. That is the actual agenda. And that transcends all presidential administrations. Again, if you look through the rhetoric, they're saying it. They're telling you this.
Yeah. And, the things that you outline here, Brian, are incredibly important, because what I feel like oftentimes happens when it comes to what Donald Trump says, or what the what it even does, what the administration even does, which here is, on the face of it, a very positive development, talking with Russia, beginning peace negotiations. However, what often happens, I feel like, is the surface. There's a lot of hope beyond hope, right? They always say cope beyond cope, like a lot of hope that this will lead to a confirmation of what Donald Trump and what whatever U.S. political figure says they are, without regard to, well, what exactly could happen, should happen, and will happen. Because I think what should happen, of course, is everything that you said. The United States should do exactly as you said. Donald Trump literally just axed what wasn't even happening, which is, I think, a testament to a lot of what Donald Trump is doing right now, is axing the high-speed rail in California project. That's never going to happen. Well, it wasn't happening anyway, but it is a testament to, well, yeah, there isn't a commitment to building up the United States at all. There isn't a commitment to improving its infrastructure. Actually, there's a commitment to pushing away, even with regard to Taiwan and China. There's a huge push to keep them away, keep their tariffs. What that does is actually keeps things away. So advancements like what China's done with renewables, like what Taiwan and China now increasingly are doing with semiconductors, all that will be kept away, because that's what tariffs are. They are a tax on the American people, which actually keeps away the kind of investment that's needed to learn how to do certain things, like maybe build better electric cars, which Elon Musk can't do anymore. He laughed back in the day. Ha 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 ha. China will never catch up to us. Now China has. They build better electric cars, cheaper.
I remember
better.
that.
And now there's 100% tariffs on them that I haven't heard Donald Trump want to reverse. But Brian, I wanted to ask you now to comment on this. This is, it seems like every day Donald Trump is saying something that is shocking the establishment in a sense. This one actually shocked me, and I want your comments on it, because I'm curious on whether you believe this is genuine or whether you believe this is like a bait and switch, a trap, so to speak, because this is what he said, Donald Trump, to the media as this Trump-Putin conversation was at the height of the headlines.
One of the first meetings I want to have is with President Xi of China, President Putin of Russia, and I want to say, let's cut our military budget in half. And we can do that. And I think we'll be able to do it.
Elon Musk identified
One of the first meetings.
So here he's saying, Brian, he wants, and he elaborated in the media too. He said, everybody, not just Russia and China, but everybody is going to cut it in half. And on the face of it, Brian, that would be a monumental shift geopolitically, that would be an incredible feat that would buck the trend of the last half century plus. So what do you make of this?
I mean, out of one side of his mouth, he's saying something like this, and there's no details, there's no, there's no structure to any of it. It's just a statement that he's saying. And then out of the other side of his mouth and everyone in his administration, they're talking about expanding. They're not talking about reducing NATO funding. They're talking about drastically expanding it by having NATO members almost twice as much as what they're already spending on NATO. So how do you reconcile this? And again, you have to look at what's happening. The United States wants dominion over the entire planet, and they're admitting that they cannot. They cannot, and they have to make difficult decisions about what they need to cut out so that they can continue trying to pursue this. At the end of the day, it's a completely unsustainable objective, but they will not recognize that, and they will not discard this objective. So you're losing this contest that you yourself are voluntarily pursuing, and now you're trying to convince, well, maybe we get all these other countries to cut their military budgets. Again, look at the U.S. Look at what the U.S. is spending on its military versus the next top 10 nations. I think it's more than the next 10 nations combined. I think they're spending more on the military. If you cut what the U.S. is spending in half, it's still a huge amount of military spending relative to all of these other nations. If you ask them to cut their spending in half, it would put a significant dent into what they're doing, because their spending is efficient. They're getting more out of their money. So do you see how it would put the U.S. it would look really good, like at face value, just like you're saying, Danny. It sounds great. But when you really think about the details of it, it's just to put the U.S. in a better position to reassert dominance over the planet. And I don't think anyone is foolish enough to fall for this. They're not going to fall for this in Beijing or in Moscow, but there's going to be significant pressure placed on them because of how good it looks at face value. The public will say, the American public will say, oh, why doesn't Russia and China want to cut their military budget in half like we did? That's suspicious. That makes it look like they're the problem. And if you read the policy papers these think tanks put out, that is the trick behind every policy. Make the U.S. look like they want diplomacy, like they're the reasonable ones that want peace, and make all the nations that they're actually targeting and antagonizing and brutalizing, make them look like the aggressors. This is what they've done to Iran. That's what they did to Syria. That's what they did to Libya, Russia, China, all of these countries. That is how they play this game. And this is just the next trick in the next round of this game.
Yeah, well, actually, China has been very angry, Brian. I don't know if you saw that there was already a freedom of navigation exercise launched by the Trump administration, or at least approved by the Trump administration. China reacts angrily after first U.S. transit of Taiwan Strait under Trump. Less than a month into the new Trump administration, the U.S. conducted what it calls a freedom of navigation exercise, sending 2 U.S. naval vessels through the politically sensitive Taiwan Strait. Chinese spokespersons reacted angrily with what they perceive as a show of force and a possible signal the new Trump administration's stance on China. Of course, China is aggressive. We've talked about this over and over again. That's what it says. But the U.S. frequently sends vessels and aircrafts to the Strait. Media reports suggest that the U.S. conducted transits 8 times in 2024, with the last vessel going through the Strait in October and a plane flying over the Strait in November. The transit occurred through a corridor in the Taiwan Strait that is beyond any coastal territorial seas, said Navy Commander Matthew Comer, a spokesperson of the U.S. military's Indo-Pacific Command, reporting on this week's transit. So not a lot of extensive details provided, Brian, but essentially what this means is that more warships are sailing through the Taiwan Strait. Now, this comes, Brian, after Trump has said he wants to meet with Xi Jinping. This also comes as, once again, Pete Hegseth. I can bring up what he had to say. This was before his comments at the Ramstein group. Here's what he had to say about China.
We don't want conflict with China. We don't want the president ran on being a peace president, and he's delivered that of being strong, peace through strength, is how you deter that. And we want to posture for that, just like we believe the Europeans, alongside our support, need to on the continent as well.
Is China the biggest threat to the United States?
Well, right now, the biggest threat was securing our own border, which we are addressing rapidly. And I'm proud of what Northcom has done and the Defense Department has done in shifting there. You don't have a country if you don't have borders, as the president has pointed out. And we've been defending other people's borders for a long time to defend ours. So we're sealing that border. We're continuing to doing that. But as far as external threats, there's just no doubt the Communist Chinese ambitions are robust. Their view of the world is quite different than ours. And whoever carries that mantle is going to set the tone for the 21st century. We don't want conflict.
So there you have it, Brian. I mean, setting the tone for the 21st century, that's essentially what all the neocons say about China in terms of containment and this approach. But again, there's this contradiction of, well, we want peace. We want to focus on our border. And it's almost like a deflection away from the question. And then as he comes back to it, it's, well, the Communist Chinese are the biggest external threat. We need to prepare for that. And then the Trump administration, within a week of his his term, his next term, I should say, not his first term, but his current term, there's more freedom of navigation exercises. That's not the border of the United States, Brian, last time that I checked.
Yeah, last time I checked as well. And again, another example of continuity of agenda. And let me just put this in a way people maybe they can relate to. Danny, I don't want to fight you. All you have to do is just give me your house, all your belongings, go move in under the bridge, and then there won't be any fight. This is what Pete Hegseth is saying to China. All you have to do is submit to us, subordinate yourself to us, not only in your region of Asia, but also within your own borders. And as long as you do that, as long as you subordinate yourself to us and do what we tell you, hey, there doesn't have to be a fight here. Just do what we tell you. And that is what the U.S. says about all of these countries. We don't want war with Russia. All they have to do is allow us to continue encircling and containing them and eventually topple their own government and absorb them. And then there won't be a fight. Why are you doing this? Why are you making a problem here? This is what the United States is saying. And it's not, and again, I'm not just picking on the Trump administration. It's what every single administration has done since even before World War I. It was an expansionist power. And this is what it did to every nation it came in contact with. And it is what it continues to do. Now, with again, people are surprised. Oh, I thought Trump was America first. Why is he sailing naval vessels between the island province of Taiwan and the Chinese mainland? Why is he doing that? If you listened to Secretary Rubio's confirmation hearing, this is all he talked about for 4 hours. So if you listen to that, you would not be surprised at all that the U.S. is going to continue antagonizing China. Did you know, and I know you know this, Danny, but do people know that the U.S. actually has troops stationed in Taiwan, which is recognized under international law as Chinese territory? Under the United States' own bilateral agreement with China, the One China policy, they recognize Taiwan as part of China and the People's Republic of China as the sole legitimate government of all of China. And yet they play this double game where they are encouraging separatism in Taiwan. They even have U.S. troops there in Taiwan, which is an act of war. And by right, China has the ability to wage war against the U.S. for violating their territorial integrity, undermining their sovereignty and their political independence. And yet they're not. They're being very patient. And so for Secretary Hegseth to say China is the threat, I mean, again, just bold-faced lie, just like every administration before this one. And this is at the root of the problem with China. If we want to talk about NATO trying to absorb Russia being the root cause of the conflict in Ukraine, the root cause of tensions between the U.S. and China is U.S. encroachment on China, U.S. violation of Chinese borders. Right now, that is what the U.S. is doing. And this is what China is reacting to. And what they do and what the media does, left, right media, doesn't matter. They present this to the public as if China is the problem. If you were listening to the confirmation hearing with Secretary Rubio, you will hear that everyone, Republican and Democrat, they were all on board with this confrontation with China and this idea that China is at the root of all of America's problems. So again, if you're listening to what they're actually saying and you cut through the partisan rhetoric, you can see what the core agenda is, and that agenda continues regardless of who is in the White House. I mean, I'm saying it a million times, but it's self-evident if you actually look and pay attention.
Well, I know there's a lot of people who want to believe that Rubio will behave differently because Trump is the one pulling on the leash. But as you said, his confirmation hearing, Brian, was not encouraging. So as we have literal freedom of information, freedom of navigation, freedom of information, freedom of navigation exercises happening, it was outbursts like these in his confirmation hearing, which didn't give anyone confidence, I don't believe, or at least anyone paying attention confidence, that there will be some kind of shift in this Ukraine talk that we're having. You know, the video we played on everyone cutting their military budgets. We have Trump and Putin talking. Negotiations will occur, but there have been strong indications that this will be the shift. Let's just listen to Marco Rubio here during this confirmation hearing.
We welcome the Chinese Communist Party into the global order, and they took advantage of all of its benefits. They ignored all of its obligations and responsibilities. Instead, they have repressed and lied and cheated and hacked and stolen their way into global superpower status, and they have done so at our expense and at the expense of the people of their own country.
So it was outbursts like that, Brian, which, you know, and in that same confirmation here, he said that China is the biggest external threat to the United States right now. So here we have the Secretary of State, which, you know, ostensibly will be working under the president, Donald Trump. But Donald Trump has, on the one hand, said he wants to talk to Xi Jinping, he wants to change the world together. And on the other, has allowed all of Hegseth, Rubio, they've all said that China is the big number one threat. And also Trump has said he's not going to talk to Xi Jinping anytime soon, after he said he was going to talk to him immediately. That also happened. Your thoughts, Brian?
No, exactly. This is what they all think. This is what everyone in Washington thinks. And a lot of Americans are brainwashed to think this, that somehow China is lying, cheating, and stealing. And I heard a U.S. senator even say this during the confirmation hearing for Jamieson Greer, the U.S. trade representative. China lies, cheats, and steals. And this is how they're trying to rationalize a non-white nation surpassing not just the U.S., but the collective West. And this is something that has not happened in recent history. And I'm talking about centuries. Hasn't happened for centuries. And they find it unacceptable. It's unacceptable for a non-white nation to surpass not just the US, but the collective West. They believe they are inherently superior to China. And if you listen to them, they're still talking like this. Even though they only make up 5% of the global population, the US believes somehow they're inherently superior, that they can innovate and work hard, and they can still somehow outcompete China, which is 4 to 5 times larger in terms of population, a massive industrial base, graduating millions of STEM graduates more every single year than the United States, world-class infrastructure that the U.S. doesn't have and probably will never have, not under the current political order in the U.S. And I don't mean the Trump administration, I mean the whole system as it exists today. The U.S. will never have infrastructure as China does right now. And so it's irrational. It's irrational to think your smaller country, for some reason, should not only be more powerful than China, but that China must subordinate itself to your country. And they think this because they believe in their own inherent superiority. They believe Americans, the West, is inherently superior to everyone else, including China, even though all of the facts demonstrate that, no, this isn't true. Human beings are equal. The Chinese people have worked hard, and they have built a superior system that is outcompeting the collective West. There's no doubt about that. And you can accuse them of lying, cheating, and stealing. But wasn't it Mike Pompeo himself who admitted that that is what the U.S. does as a matter of policy, especially through the CIA, that the U.S. lies, cheats, and steals? So don't act as if the U.S. has been so benevolent and generous and it's the evil Chinese taking advantage. The system the U.S. created and imposed on the world was meant to serve American interests and American interests only, at the expense of everyone else on the planet Earth. And now they're angry because the playing field is leveling and these nations are gaining ground. The gaps are closing, and in many ways, the rest of the world is now surpassing the West. So this is their system collapsing, their system of belief in their own inherent superiority utterly collapsing. And instead of facing that reality and dealing with it in a rational, moral, intellectual way, they're stomping, they're kicking, and they're screaming. And they're going to do all of this stomping, kicking, and screaming at the expense of the actual American people and the people of this entire planet, because this is going to, and this already is, the core issue that is destabilizing the planet, that is obstructing peace, prosperity, stability, and everything that we all want to see, regardless of our nationality, where we are on this planet. These are the things we want to see. And the U.S., its pursuit of empire, is obstructing it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely, Brian. Definitely. It's going to be a very bumpy ride, Brian. I mean, we're in for what is to be a chaotic, to say the least, first 100 days of the Trump administration. We're likely to see these negotiations take place between Russia and the United States. We're also likely going to see more of the Trump administration's foreign policy take shape in more concrete ways than simply rhetoric, which is a lot of what we have seen thus far beyond this phone call. So in your estimation, Brian, given what we've heard from the Trump administration, everything from we're going to cut our military budget and we want to cut everybody's we want everyone to cut their military budget, to we want peace in Ukraine, to we want to focus on the threat of the communist Chinese, which is a really, really, really big shout out to the McCarthyist Cold War era rhetoric. And then, of course, we have the Middle East, which, we have a Gaza displacement plan, and we have a lot of silence on Iran right now. But we know Trump's record on this from the past. So, Brian, before we get to viewer questions, your thoughts on, where you see things going from here.
I mean, it's very easy. It's all going to just continue in the same direction it's been going all along. I mean, they are telling you, the Trump administration is telling you, we want to create a buffer zone in Ukraine. We want to keep sending weapons and support to Ukraine, but we want to do it through European intermediaries because we need to focus on the war that we are provoking with China, but also in the Middle East with Iran. They need to focus on that. Secretary Hegseth admitted during his press conference at NATO that there are real limits to American power. Admitting this is not the same as addressing it. Not addressing the fact that why do you have these limits? Why are you trying to pursue a global primacy in the first place? Doesn't even make sense. At face value, it doesn't make any sense. You're admitting that there's limits to it, but you're not talking about ending this irrational pursuit of global primacy. You're just talking about how to rework the formula so you could do it more efficiently. Which reminds me of all these people saying, Brian, what about USAID and the NED? They're dismantling America's foreign interference network. I'm at the receiving end of U.S. interference here in Southeast Asia, and I'm telling you that it has not ended. It has not skipped a beat. It continues unabated. And over the last couple of years, again, to demonstrate how this is all a matter of continuity of agenda, they had been diversifying the ways they are routing this funding to these groups that they use to interfere, because there was growing awareness of the National Endowment for Democracy and the USAID. There was growing awareness and there was growing pushback against it. And what the US was increasingly doing was using private foundations, which is a trick the CIA has used all along, and rerouting the money through its European proxy. So instead of US ambassadors meeting with all these agitators, they would have the German ambassador meet with them, or the Finnish ambassador go and meet them. I follow these groups closely. I know the names of the organizations. I know the name of the people in these organizations. I've been in their offices before I did videos. I wrote anonymously. None of these people knew who I was. I had a friend who was an activist who was regularly in these offices, and I would go with them from time to time into these offices. So I know them very well, and I know that this apparent funding cut has not done anything to interrupt U.S. interference abroad. And that if you listen to Secretary Rubio or Secretary Cashapp, they're telling you that U.S. interference worldwide is going to continue. They just need to reorganize the manner in which they conduct this interference, because ultimately they are still talking about primacy, achieving primacy. When they talk about China threatening American interests, they're not talking about China threatening America, its territory within its borders. They always use the word interest. What are those interests? American monopolies controlling everything everywhere. And yes, China is threatening that, but these are monopolies that shouldn't exist to begin with. They've been a major source of injustice, instability, death, and destruction for decades. And I think it's time that it comes to an end. China, Russia, the multipolar world, by introducing a balance of power, while not perfect, is already remedying this injustice and this imbalance, and it needs to continue. And if Americans actually care about America, they need to hold the person that they picked and that they support accountable for his America First slogan. Make it more than a slogan, and make it more than branding slapped on age-old American imperialism. Make it about turning inward and investing in America and leaving the rest of the world alone. The rest of the world wants to work with the United States, but what they don't want is the U.S. telling them what to do within their own borders, creating monopolies and imposing those monopolies on them so they themselves cannot develop their own economy, their own solutions to their own problems in their own way. The U.S. wouldn't tolerate anyone doing this to them. These nations have no reason to tolerate the U.S. doing it to them. Up until now, they've had no power to do this. The rise of China, the reemergence of Russia, the rise of multipolarism is now allowing them to do so. So I welcome that as a positive development. But like I said, the U.S. is going to kick and scream all the way through this process. It's going to be a very painful process, and people are just kidding themselves, thinking that anything is changing for the better under this current administration.
Brian, I want to get to viewer questions right now. I've just been taking super chats. If anybody had questions that aren't super chats, please do send them now, and I can take them in the chat. Just put a little, I don't know, an emoji or something, anything to differentiate it from the comments. We had one question that I can't pull up, although the person gave a very generous super chat, Monzer Chahab. But I do remember the question. I did write it down, and it has to do with the National Endowment for Democracy. Brian, you mentioned it before. You did mention how it has not necessarily been defunded, but Monzer wanted to know the mechanics of this. Has it been? How does that work? You know, the IRI, the International Republican Institute, for example, works under the umbrella of this swarm of organizations. And so I'm curious, Brian, your thoughts on this, because the USAID development, on the one hand, has essentially made it more difficult for this organization to function overall, and that has affected some of the regime change components, but it hasn't eliminated those regime change components. Brian, your thoughts?
Well, again, I'm here based in Thailand. Absolutely every single organization that the U.S. funds to interfere in the internal political affairs of Thailand and also the rest of the region of Southeast Asia, absolutely every single one of them is still open for business and conducting interference on a daily basis. They have not even, because I follow all of them on social media. I have people here in Thailand who go through all of the Thai language posts, and they have not even so much as said anything about funding being disrupted. So it continues. And as a matter of fact, I think it's highly suspicious that none of these organizations are talking about even the rumors that NED funding might be cut. And I would say that it's because the NED has told them not to, because the NED is obviously in contact with all of them. They're the ones that give them their marching orders. We have caught leaked conversations between the NED leadership and their organizations that they fund. We know that that is what they do. So none of this has been into. So I understand people see the Trump administration claim to dismantle USAID, claim to dismantle the NED, or whatever it is that they're claiming they're doing with the NED. And everyone is excited about the process of them dismantling it, and they're excited about it. But are you actually checking overseas to see if the interference has stopped? And if it has not stopped, then there's more than meets the eye taking place here. And I said for years, because the NED was being exposed by people like us, Danny, as growing awareness, governments started pushing back against it. They started passing foreign agent laws. They started clamping down on this overt US government funding for all of these opposition groups. They began gradually rerouting the funding. They didn't cut the funding. They're rerouting it through supposedly private foundations that are opaque, that make it very difficult to even find out about the funding, let alone expose it and create public outrage against it. And before the Trump administration started talking about dismantling US aid and the NED, it was already becoming increasingly hard for people like me to expose US government-funded interference here. I know these organizations are funded by the US. They themselves, during meetings, again, that I had access to, admitted that they get no support here in the country for their activities. They admitted this because someone asked them, why do you take US money? It undermines your legitimacy. Why do you do it? And they said, because no one in Thailand funds us. No one in Thailand will fund us. That's why we take the money. So this is still very much a problem. They're not dismantling it. They're camouflaging it, which enhances the menace of US interference worldwide, not diminish it. So again, I understand why people are excited at face value, but you need to make sure the actual purpose of this is to actually dismantle US interference abroad and not just cover it up and make it more effective by making it harder to expose.
Yeah, indeed. Brian, here's another question from Cosmo Ray. Your opinion on Panama withdrawing from Belt and Road Initiative. You know, when I saw this, Brian, it reminded me of during the Biden administration, I believe it was Italy actually withdrew from the Belt and Road Initiative. This is not necessarily a new policy, so to speak, but I do believe it was a kind of a good microcosm on what we can expect the Trump administration to do far more of, especially in Latin America, which the Republicans generally have a very keen interest on focusing on and paying even more attention to, especially in the realm of overt foreign policy. But your thoughts on Panama withdrawing from the Belt and Road Initiative?
Danny, as you just pointed out, it's continuity of agenda. This was what was going on under the Biden administration. The U.S. was coercing nations to end their cooperation with China. Constructive cooperation that was benefiting them to go back to being a U.S. proxy turned into a battering ram against China. Many of these nations count China as one of their, if not their largest trade partner, one of their largest trade partners, largest investor, largest source of tourism, and a viable partner for building actual modern and desperately needed infrastructure. The Philippines is another example. This happened before the Trump administration. The U.S. went in there. They interfered in the elections. They got a compliant proxy installed into power, and he immediately ended all of the construction projects that the country was working on with China. China is the Philippines' largest export partner, trade partner overall. And the U.S. said, stop cooperating with China, stop building infrastructure with China, and confront China. Let us build military bases in your, refurbish existing military bases in your country. And here's some missiles to point at China. Instead of working with them, point missiles at them. That should fix your crippling poverty that you have faced for decades. What people might not know is that the Philippines was literally colonized by the U.S. The people there rose up in revolt. The U.S. brutally suppressed the revolt. And even on the State Department's official Office of the Historian website, they admit that they operated concentration camps, and they mass murdered people, and they tortured people. So that's what the U.S. did to the Philippines. If you look at the Philippines today in Southeast Asia as an ASEAN member, they have a larger population than Thailand, but a lower GDP. And it is precisely because the U.S. has crippled their ability to develop, and specifically because they are crippling and inhibiting their cooperation with China and all the economic benefits that entails. So Panama is just a continuation of this. The U.S. doing to Panama what it did to the Philippines under the Biden administration. Now it is continuing unabated under the Trump administration. What else is there to say? And one thing to say is that Secretary Rubio was crying and complaining about how they built the Panama Canal 111 years ago and how they should be entitled to do whatever they want with it and travel through it for free. But isn't this what Secretary Rubio accuses China of through the Belt and Road Initiative, debt trap diplomacy, and using the construction of infrastructure to then, for indefinitely, to dominate these countries they build these projects in, which is not what China's doing. That's what the U.S. accuses China of doing. But then that's what the U.S. openly does with Panama, despite the canal being built 111 years ago and having already officially been handed over to Panama decades ago.
And here's another good question, Brian. What would it take for the Cold War indoctrination in the West to be broken? There are some other questions we can get to toward the last few that are a little more specific to Thailand, but I think this is a good one to frame exactly what we've been talking about here, Brian. We've seen the Trump administration, for all of its movement toward a new kind of way of approaching Ukraine, for example, one that many would view as positive, but still this Cold War orientation, especially of the United States being on top. What does Donald Trump say about this? He says, well, we're getting the United States to be back on top, not we're getting the United States to become a fair and equal partner with the rest of the world. No, it's to be back on top. It's to be back on top of Europe to an even greater degree, but also to be back on top of everybody.
Yes, absolutely. Again, it goes back to look at a pie chart of the world population and what component the U.S. constitutes. It's less than 5%, and yet they assume dominion over the entire planet, which is, it's insane. It's irrational. It doesn't make any sense at all unless you believe that somehow, again, you are inherently superior. So if you want to know how this cycle, this cycle of conflict can end, it has to end in the minds of the people driving U.S. foreign policy, which will never happen. These people are, to their core, supremacists, racists, and they put profit over everything. Any other type of profit is their purpose. There is no other purpose for them. Profit and power over purpose. So what you need is circles of interest in the United States, like we see in other countries around the globe, that put purpose over profit. It's not that they don't want or get profits. I would say people would agree that China is enjoying a lot of profits, but they put purpose above profits. From their point of view, infrastructure is meant to facilitate business. It's not meant to make money, to maximize profit. So the West looks at the high-speed rail network and they say some routes are losing money. But from China's point of view, looking at the big picture, even though that one line is losing money, other lines are making money. But the point isn't to make money, it's to move people around. That is the point of mass transportation. It's not to make money in and of itself as an investment. That's how it's viewed in the West. But from their point of view, it's to facilitate business and prosperity for everyone, everywhere inside the country. And that is how they view everything. Power plants, the housing market. President Xi Jinping said during the bubble, the real estate bubble, he said, houses are for people to live in. You know, they're not casino. Well, he didn't say this, but just to explain to you, it's for people to live in. There's supposed to be structures that provide you shelter. They're not chips in a casino game, which is how a lot of people look at the real estate market. It's just an instrument of speculation that they can use to make money. So that's what you have to change. And the current circles of interest in the US will never change. The American people, and I always say this, look at multipolarism. That is nations around the world putting purpose over profit and building an alternate system that puts their priorities first. Americans need to think about how to do that. To, instead of handing your paycheck every month to these corporations that drive US foreign and domestic policy, prioritizing profit over purpose, spend your money locally. invest in companies that represent the multipolar world. Stop handing your money, your power, your time, your energy, your attention to these special interests that are running the country into the ground in blind pursuit of profits, and put your money somewhere else. And this is how you're going to, between multipolarism rising and the mindsets of Americans at home changing, maybe eventually circles of interests that have a constructive role they want to play in the world rather than impose themselves on the world. Maybe they will get into power and things will change. It's not unprecedented. It has happened in other countries around the world. It could happen in the US, but it's going to take a lot of hard work and sacrifice. It's not going to be just every 4 years casting a vote. That is not how you're going to change it.
Yeah, definitely not in not in a duopoly system that is completely tied to what did Hegseth say about Russia, that lowering gas prices is important. Sanctions, and lowering those gas and oil prices, because all of this is going into Russia's war machine. But actually, the two parties in the United States are essentially bound and wedded to an actual war machine, one that is very much for profit, unlike Russia's, which, as we've seen, has been able to scale way up because it is the exact opposite. But there was one other question here, Brian, I wanted to get to. I can't find them anymore, but they wanted to ask you, Brian, about one, the prospects of representative democracy in Thailand, as well as I think Chiang Mai base, whether that is a spy base. So essentially a question about Thailand and its politics, which I think is relevant here because we're talking a lot about USAID, NED. We're talking about regime change. We're talking about U.S. foreign policy and its actual roots. So you're in Thailand. You can speak to what this all means, especially for this idea of representative democracy.
Well, what is representative democracy in reality? It is a Western system of control that has been imposed on nations all around the world. Thailand didn't arrive at this system voluntarily. It was imposed upon them, and it is a system of control. It is not a system of self-determination. And whether people want to admit it or not, I forget who said it. It was a Chinese translator who translates for the senior level of the Chinese government. He said, look, people are too emotional. If you ask them to vote for, say, who is the president of China, they don't understand how a country is run, and they're easily manipulated emotionally. So, and just as you see in the West, they're not going to be able to make a truly informed decision. If you don't understand how infrastructure, energy, agriculture, industry, all of these things work, military matters, international relations. If you don't understand how any of this works, how can you pick the most qualified person to oversee all of these areas that are so essential for a nation to run itself? So what they do in China instead is the people vote for their local representatives, because that is something they can wrap their minds around. It is their community. They see it with their eyes. They walk through it every day, and they can make an informed decision about who they think is best able to serve them locally. Those elected officials then choose the next level of governance, so on and so forth, until you get to the president. Obviously, and nobody who has actually been to China or knows anything about China, really knows something about China, not just repeat what they saw on TV. You know that China, its system, serves the best interests of the people. You can see it. You can walk through the country and enjoy this society that has been built in service of the people. And in many ways, a lot of countries throughout Asia have a system very much like that. Here in Thailand, there's elements of that in the government. And all we've seen through representative democracy here in Thailand is the US manipulating the political process, building up opposition parties, and getting them into power from one election to the next. And then those people who were elected are not serving the best interests of the Thai people. They're serving Washington's best interests at the expense of the Thai people, whether the Thai people are aware of that or not, because of the process of propagandizing them. They're not aware of it. So that's what I would say about representative governance. It was imposed on Thailand as a system of control used by the West to serve American interests at the expense of Thai interests. Some of the things these politicians are proposing when they do manage to get into power are things like, let's cut all of our projects with China. Let's roll back our relationship with China. Let's pivot back to the US, Japan, and Australia, which have nothing to actually offer us as an alternative, just to subordinate the country to the US and then pivot it as a proxy against China, just like Ukraine. So that's what I would say about that. The next thing, the consulate in Chiang Mai is massive. They were rebuilding it, is like a massive fortress. The US Embassy in Bangkok is massive. It is huge. It occupies entire blocks of the city. Why? Is it because there's so many Americans here in Thailand? No, the largest group of tourists coming into Thailand now are Chinese tourists. And there's more tourists from China coming into Thailand every single year than all Western countries combined, including the United States. So why does the US have these huge fortress embassies and consulates in Thailand? Because they are centers of regional subversion. The US is running all of the regime change operations here in Thailand out of these facilities, but also all of the subversion region-wide. It is a regional hub for US subversion. The violent, decade-spanning conflict ravaging Myanmar to Thailand's west is being run out of the consulate in Chiang Mai. The Westerners who are in Myanmar training, arming, supplying the terrorists and militants fighting the central government there literally cross the border and report to the consulate in Chiang Mai, just to give you an idea of how that works. And on my channel, The New Atlas on YouTube, there's a search bar. You can search my channel specifically and just type in Myanmar, Chiang Mai, Thailand, and I've done entire videos about this and shown the WikiLeaks cables admitting to all of this.
Yeah. And I just want to say too, as you said, Ryan, representative democracy used by the United States and the collective West, it's often a political weapon. Governments, nations like Thailand or anybody else, China, Russia, multipolar worlds in general, they should have the right to determine what kind of governments they want. They should have the right to choose. And that's up to the people to decide. That is exactly what the National Endowment for Democracy and these arms of the regime change apparatus of the United States want to subvert. They want to subvert the people's choice. And it's not, this isn't to say that governments all around the world, including China's and Russia's, don't have issues that we may not always agree with. But at the end of the day, people make decisions of how they want to live based on their own right to self-determination. That is their right internationally under international law to be able to determine, no matter how hard that struggle is, to do that on their own. It just so happens that the reason why that UN principle even exists is because we had a long period that still continues on to this day, just in different form, but a long period of actual colonial subjugation by Western powers. The United States also took part in that. That led to many world wars, and that's what led to actually the UN system, which, for all of its flaws, there's a reason why the UN Charter has self-determination in there. But also, Brian, I just wanted to say this too. When it comes to the overall posture of the Trump administration, some may say, hey, it's early. It's only the first couple of weeks. And this is true, which is why I come at it from the perspective of, okay, well, let us actually see. And how do we deduce what we can actually expect from what's going to happen? Well, we look at what is being said, and we have to look at the contradictions. They cannot be ignored, because that would be also to ignore this laundry list of policies that form an overall posture, to use what Pete Hegseth constantly says, a posture. Well, this posture of the United States, Trump or otherwise, is to weaken, diminish, and ultimately destroy any alternative to its domination and rule. If that is ultimately the rubric from which U.S. foreign policy is shaped, and those interests that you've stated, Brian, that dictate how U.S. foreign policy is shaped, the financial, the economic, the monopolies, the corporations, the banks, and everyone that they hire, which politicians are in the United States, they are ultimately hires of these forces, then we should expect then that unless people, and I'm not going to discredit that people are having an impact on, for example, Ukraine policy, on, for example, why even Donald Trump, before his wacky, wild Gaza comments, his displacement rhetoric, before that, Donald Trump was trying to pivot away because he didn't want to inherit an open genocide. He didn't want to do that because that ultimately sank the Biden administration. So there is an impact being made. I think that is true. People want the Ukraine war to end. People don't want to see an open genocide. Donald Trump has responded to these in kind, but that does not make up a fundamental change. In fact, what I believe is actually going to happen is that we're going to see this 100-day shuffle come and go, and then we are actually going to see what actually transpires under this administration, which I believe will be different in some ways. But really, when we look back at this 4 years from now, and I hope that politics are much different from now, for 4 years from now, Brian, than they are now. But let's just say we're looking back, we're going to, and everything holds the same, we're going to look back at this and say, okay, yeah, much more of the same actually occurred. And even if no new wars are waged, we will see the path laid for the next administration, the next political administration, to be able to wage those new wars. That's how I saw the Trump administration in the first place, the first time it came about. It wasn't as if the genocide in Gaza, the outbreak of regional war in the Middle East, the outbreak of the Ukraine conflict, all of that happening under Biden. It's not like Trump had no role to play in that. His administration laid a pretty solid framework for this, whether it's provoking Iran or whether it's arming Ukraine. All happened under Trump. So I think we can expect something similar, even though the conditions are going to be a lot different. And there's going to be a whole lot of jockeying and fits and starts and attempts to maybe catch a breather, perhaps. But I don't know if the train is going to depart toward the path of peace. I think it looks like it's actually going more so toward the path of how to rebrand and reorient this empire.
Absolutely, Danny. And I'm not going to blame analysts out there who are trying to extend the benefit of the doubt to the Trump administration. I get that. He's not even in office for 100 days, and they don't want to jump to any sort of conclusion. I can sort of kind of understand that. And a lot of these analysts are already criticizing things that the Trump administration is doing that are just obviously insane and wrong, and statements that he has made that make no sense or indefensible, and they are calling it out. There's others who are just papering over everything and selling this as if it's some sort of Trump is our savior and he's saving America, which is obviously not true. I'm not jumping to any conclusion. President Trump spent 4 years in office. He ran on the exact same platform then that he did now. I said before he stepped foot in the White House for his first time ever, I said, this is going to be the continuation of this singular agenda. And that is exactly what it was. And how did I know that? Because he lined his administration wall to wall with people who represent the establishment and continuity of agenda. And then that is exactly what he did. And I remember for 4 years having, and still to this day, listening to people make excuses how this grown man with billions of dollars, many more resources than I have available to myself, how he didn't know who John Bolton or Mike Pompeo were. Like, how is that even possible? They're just making excuses because they don't want to accept the fact that Trump was a politician who lied to them. He said one thing to get your support, and then he did another. Danny, you're talking about these things that he's saying that sound promising. It's pandering. Pandering is different than actual policy. And as we demonstrated, Danny, you played the clips of Secretary Hegseth saying it for himself. They want to establish a buffer zone in Ukraine, just as I have warned for 3 years, just as the Biden administration was trying to prepare and put into place. He's talking about expanding NATO, not dismantling it. That is at the root cause of this conflict with Russia. And they're sailing warships through the Strait of Taiwan, deliberately provoking China because they have no intention of America first in terms of the American people. This is American corporations, financial institutions, their interests first. It's American empire with a MAGA branding stamped on it, and it's going to continue uninterrupted. They obviously know there's a lot of pushback. There's a lot of awareness being raised. Supposedly dismantling U.S. aid and freezing NED funding. This is theater because they know people are catching on. I explained about limited hangout. This is when you're doing something, people become aware of it, so you partially admit to it, and you pretend like you're addressing it, but only partially. And the actual core of these activities that you're involved in, they will continue with actually better cover now because people think that you've already addressed it. That is exactly what is going on. I'm here at the receiving end of U.S. interference. I not literally, but I can look out my window and I can see them trashing the streets. Just yesterday, they were out trashing the streets. And it wasn't because the NED cut their money. It's because it's business as usual for U.S. interference abroad. So that is my warning to people is listen to what they're telling you. They're telling you nothing is going to change. If you look through the branding and the rhetoric, they're telling you nothing is changing. It's actually going to get much worse.
Yes, indeed. Well, everybody, I want you to first, I have a few announcements before we close out here. So actually tomorrow in about a little over 14 hours from now, this was not a schedule I should repeat very often, but our mutual friend Mark Sloboda will be here on this show. That's actually public now. You can set the date. You can be sure to, go in the waiting area, hit the like button, all that stuff. It's 1 p.m. Eastern time, 10 a.m. Pacific on February 14th. We will continue this conversation on Putin, Trump, Russia, Ukraine, and what's next. I believe Munich is going to be underway. There's supposedly, negotiations starting. Trump is floating G7. Mark will, of course, go on his soapbox and be sure to analyze, give you all the developments. He is a reporter and an analyst, very one of a kind. So be sure, 1 p.m. Eastern, February 14th. Now, there's one other thing I want to announce. Not only can you follow Brian on Telegram and YouTube below in the video description, but also I want you to consider a friend of this show, Richard Medhurst, has had a really horrific time of late. Not only was he charged under the Terrorism Act in the UK, being arrested and detained at Heathrow Airport months ago, and that investigation is ongoing with no resolution. But now Vienna, the intelligence services there are charging him with being a member of Hamas, which is absolutely ridiculous. But he has been covering Gaza, Palestine, the Middle East, West Asia, resistance, all of that for so many months, and has essentially been he has been silenced. He is not, under these investigations, it's really difficult for him to do the work that he does. He just had a lot of his equipment confiscated. So I put his GoFundMe in the video description if you want to give anything to Richard to help him get back on his feet as he deals with this horrible ordeal. I would hope the same would be extended to people like myself and Brian, because this work is not simply a labor of love, something we can just do freely without any concerns at all. No, there are legitimate concerns. I know, Brian, you've had concerns about how you travel, what all this kind of thing. I've had these concerns myself. I've been lucky enough yet to not have to deal with this directly, but seeing people around us be targeted in this way is certainly chilling. So be sure to go to the video description and you can find his GoFundMe. And of course, all the ways you can support this work here so you can keep it going. Without further ado, anything, Brian, that you would like to part with, say, before we head out?
For people who think I'm being negative or unfair or that I'm lying, and or that I'm some kind of liberal with Trump derangement syndrome, forgetting that for the last 4 years, I've been opposed to everything the Biden administration has been doing, the Trump administration before that, 8 years of Obama, so on and so forth. Ask yourself if it's really because the evidence at hand suggests that I'm lying, or the evidence at hand is something you simply do not want to accept because it makes you feel uncomfortable with what you wish was going on. It's a human condition to hope and want to see what you want manifest itself, and to delve into denial when it doesn't. We were watching the pro-Ukrainian camp do that for 3 years straight, and no one is immune to it. You have to check yourself, make sure that it's because of facts and not your fantasies that you wish were real. It's very important. And thank you, Danny, so much for having me on. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and listening to me, and for everybody's support for Danny's show and mine. Like Danny just said, it's difficult work. I personally hate doing it. I wish Trump saved America and the world. I literally would close my channel down and go back to doing industrial design, which was my passion in life. And I do this because I feel like I have to, Danny. I don't think that you wake up and enjoy going through headlines like the headlines that we have to look through. So anyway, thank you again, Danny, and thank you, everybody, for your support.
Yeah, of course, of course. Well, yeah, it's for me, it's the positive comes in the fact, it's so interesting that people call you negative, Brian, or that, I feel like there's so much partisanship going on right now. It's hard not to get swept up in the new presidential administration. But for me, the positives come from why there's why certain politicians, why a government like the United States will have to behave in a certain way. I don't, if Ukraine was winning, if Russia actually had been, defeated, first of all, Donald Trump wouldn't be president right now. But second of all, there would be no question about peace and negotiations. All of this is coming because Russia has successfully beaten back what was the most intense regime change operation against it over the past 10 years plus now. So that is why, and then of course culminating in the special military operation, that is why this is all happening. And so Trump's rhetoric, even what Trump does, a phone call, how am I supposed to get excited? Am I going to get excited about a phone call because Biden wouldn't do it? It's like a phone call. A phone call isn't even, it's the first step. It is the first step that is being dictated, honestly, by the realities on the ground. To get swept up in partisanship is going to be, I believe, a kind of a crushing experience for many because, as you said, Brian, and we both, I'm hoping that everyone who's watching has experienced at least 2 or 3 presidential administrations. So if you've at least experienced 2 or 3 presidential administrations in your thinking development years, then you know that there's a lot of reason not only to be skeptical, but to be critical, because skepticism can be devoid of fact. But to be critical means to understand what the facts are actually telling us versus what the spin is. And sometimes they match up, sometimes they do not. And here we have a very difficult and complex case that a lot of people are saying, wait and see, wait and see. Well, yes, let's wait and see. But we should be taking all these arguments into account. Without further ado, everybody, tomorrow, 1 p.m. Eastern, Mark Sloboda will be here to give a full update on everything. So be sure to tune in. I put that link in the video description now. Let me see, actually. Let me do that real quick before we depart here. It's in the chat as well. And you should just go there and save the date, February 14th, 1 p.m. Eastern time. And I will see you all again very soon. Take care and bye-bye.